This will be lecture called Post-Reconstruction II. Where we left off, we discussed how President Garfield was assassinated by a man named Charles Guiteau. Okay, Charles Guiteau was a disappointed office seeker and shot President Garfield in the back at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad station. Guiteau, a little bit off his rocker, said that God commanded him to do this. So we're left with a president. And let me skip ahead here where we left off. There's Charles Guiteau. There's a picture of Charles Guiteau. Here is the weapon that was used. And here is a drawing of the assassination. Now, Chester A. Arthur will be our next president. And Chester A. Arthur is going to change things a little bit. Okay, he becomes president and tries to get rid of the spoil system. Remember, the spoil system is where you put in your friends or people you owe favors to, or you basically you kind of auction off that position to see what favors those people are going to do for you. And not exactly the best way politics are done, but a way that's been done for quite some time. But he doesn't believe in that. Chester A. Arthur wants to get rid of the spoil system. So under his presidency, one of the most important things that happens during this time is it's called the Pendleton Civil Service Act. And he obviously supports that. Instead of just hiring your buddies, exams are now given for candidates that want to run or want to get a job in the public office. So this was the beginning of the civil service reform in the U.S. People would no longer be fired when a new president would come in. In the past, you work for a president or you work under his administration, and when a new president comes in, you clean house. Now you would be judged on your qualifications, and you could possibly keep that job. So it no longer was who you knew, but what you knew. And that obviously is a step in the right direction. But we're going to see that's going to change again. Okay, we've had quite the roller coaster here of the belief in the merit system or the spoil system. The stalwarts, S-T-A-L-W-A-R-T-S, stalwarts, were Republicans who opposed the merit system. And they wanted to keep politics the way they were, keep those, the spoil system was how business was done. So they wanted to keep that. So they're going to be the main opposition to Chester A. Arthur as he was president, and we're going to see that's actually going to hurt him in the long run. He's not going to even be nominated when it's his turn to become president or to run for the presidency again. Okay, he was a Republican. I'm sorry, that's Garfield. Excuse me. Chester A. Arthur was a Republican. He went against his party, a lot of people in his party, with that merit system. So he will not even win the next nomination during that time. So he will just basically serve the rest of Garfield Meow's presidency, and then he'll be done. But here's his presidential page. First president to have a citizenship question. We've heard that with President Barack Obama as well. Many people believe that Arthur was actually born in Canada. He was the first to take the oath of office in his home because of the assassination. Tried to change, we just talked about that, tried to change the civil service test. And that still is in existence today. This is why he's sitting here in his school desk taking a test. So, even today, people that work for the government need to take a civil service test. And this is where it really began. Well, in the election of 1884, like we said, Arthur isn't even nominated because he upset everybody in his party for going against the spoil system. So for the Republicans, we're going to have James G. Blaine. from Maine against Grover Cleveland, who's a former governor of New York. And this gets pretty ugly, okay? Cleveland will support the civil service reform. He's a Democrat. So that's going to be one of his things. But this was a very, very dirty campaign, a lot of mudslinging. And, there was a report out that Grover Cleveland actually fathered an illegitimate child. So Blaine's camp came up with this slogan called "Ma, Ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha." So that was one of their slogans against him. Against Blaine, Grover Cleveland put one out too. Blaine, James G. Blaine, the Continental Liar from the state of Maine. So obviously those are just slogans, but it got pretty ugly, okay? Grover Cleveland actually came out and admitted that he did have an illegitimate child, and he didn't hide from it, and people actually liked his honesty. He also supported the civil service reforms for government job. So Grover Cleveland will be our next president, and here's his caricature, okay? There's right here is a story about the Baby Ruth candy bar. So a lot of people believe that it was actually named after Grover Cleveland's daughter, who was named Ruth, because she was often seen playing in the White House, or playing outside in the White House lawn. And just to show you the difference between the security from then and now, it was very common for people to walk up and take pictures with her playing in the White House. You couldn't even get close to President Obama's daughters right now, but probably for good reason. Personally, Cleveland was known as a very honest and good man, very quick-tempered and blunt, but you knew where you stood. He right here in his caricature, he's cleaning the White House. That was one of his promises, that he was going to clean out all the corruption that exists. He was a very, very popular president, and as we're going to see, he's going to actually lose the next election, but he'll be reelected again. In the election of 1888, we'll see the Democrats will throw up Grover Cleveland again, the incumbent, and the Republicans will put forth Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison. Harrison is actually the grandson of William Henry Harrison, who was president as well. That's the only time that has happened. The result, the popular votes, Cleveland wins by 100,000 plus popular votes. However, the electoral votes again, remember how we elect our president through the Electoral College. The electoral votes favor Harrison, 233, Cleveland, 168. So this is now the second time this has happened. Okay, the first time was in 1876 with Hayes, and here we are just 12 years later. It happens again with Cleveland and Harrison. So you can imagine that the Electoral College probably wasn't very popular. Now, it's only happened one more time, and that was in 2000 with the election of George W. Bush versus Al Gore, where Gore actually won the popular vote by a slim margin, and Bush wins the electoral vote. So it's only happened 3 times: Hayes, Harrison, and Bush. Well, so Harrison will win, okay? And Harrison, actually from Ohio, another Ohio president, attended Miami U. Not the most popular president because of the way he won. He actually was part of an early part of the Populist Party, is where we will start to see this grow during this time. He was president of the Homesteads during the Homestead strike in Carnegie, with Carnegie in Pennsylvania, which we'll talk about briefly. This is when the Populist Party grew. I'm sorry, I think I might have skipped over that. In 1891, we'll talk about that later. But he'll revert back to the spoil system. So here's that roller coaster again. So it seems like one president gets elected, and they believe in the merit system. Next guy, spoil system. Next guy, merit system. That's basically how it's working. So he will get rid of all the Democrats that existed in the offices in the White House and replace them with a lot of times unqualified Republicans. And that's basically how this whole thing works. Lots of unrest. Farmers were upset. Labor unrest. We talked about the Homestead strike, which we'll get into more detail shortly. So not the most popular guy. So in 1892, we see a repeat. Oh, I should go over this first. North Bend, Ohio. Let's see. The Sooners, any football fans out there, Oklahoma Sooners, are actually named after people that would cheat and get there too soon on the land. And that's what this is depicting, where they would open up the land. You can claim free plots of land for yourself in the undeveloped parts of what is now Oklahoma, trying to settle that area, and that's what these people are racing to, those plots of land. Some people would sneak out there and get there before it even started, and then they'll go from there. So that's where they get the name Sooners from. Okay, he was stiff, very formal. They often called him the human iceberg. And we talked about Benjamin Harrison's grandfather, William Henry Harrison. Okay, the election of 1892, we see Harrison runs for re-election, and Grover Cleveland runs again. Okay, once again, an ugly campaign. This is not pretty. They called Cleveland a coward because he didn't fight in the Civil War. He actually paid for a replacement, which was very common back then. You can actually, if you were drafted, you could pay for somebody to go. They hired a 32-year-old immigrant to go. Basically because Grover Cleveland had to stay home and take care of his widowed mother and two sisters. His two other brothers went to war. His replacement survived, didn't really see any battle time at all, so it really wasn't that big of a deal. However, perception wasn't very good with that. There was a poem. Grover Cleveland's poem's terrible, but I'll read it anyway. Grover Cleveland sent a substitute where he dared not to go, into the Union Army to face a rebel foe. There he left this poor old German to die a death of woe while he was boasting of our Union victory. So that was a poem that was used during that election, but as we know, in reality, his replacement did not die, didn't even see any action. But still, Grover Cleveland also gets married to a woman. At the time, she was 21 years old. Her name is Frances Folsom. Frances Folsom. And they were married in the White House in 1888. So there was a little talk there. She was 21. He was 49. So there was some issues with that as well, and that got brought up. Grover Cleveland will win this election pretty easily because Harrison just wasn't very popular, and he'll continue to do his thing, but he loses popularity as time goes on. There's issues with the economy. An issue with Cuba came up, where should we get involved and help out our friends in Cuba against Spain? There's another issue in Hawaii that's going to pop up that he won't act on, where our farmers in Hawaii, Hawaii was actually an independent country at this time. Should we help our farmers in Hawaii get things that they want? And it becomes a whole issue with that. So he loses some popularity over that. An interesting story about him is he is the only president to have a job as an executioner. He was once an executioner when he was in Buffalo, New York. His job was to spring the trap door on the gallows, and supposedly did that twice. But only president to be elected to 2 non-consecutive terms, the only time that ever happened. During his 2 terms, Grover Cleveland used his veto power 584 times. This was the highest total up until FDR. and that was because they had a Republican-controlled House. But like I said, he lost popularity. Number one, serious depression. Number two, people blamed him for not helping Cuba. And three, for not helping the American farmers in Hawaii. So by the end of his presidency, he turns out to not be a very popular president. Now, 1896, we'll see a Republican, William McKinley, go against a Democrat, William Jennings Bryan from Nebraska. McKinley is another Ohio president. McKinley is elected. He was born in Niles, Ohio in 1843. Became a teacher at age 17. Age 21, joined the Union Army. He hated slavery. He was a sergeant promoted to lieutenant for an act of bravery in the Battle of Antietam, where he risked his life on numerous occasions trying to bring rations to some of his troops. So water and food. He risked his life trying to do that. He will become a lawyer after the war and then will join the Republican Party. He's elected governor of Ohio in 1891. Okay. Now, as president, he favored full rights for all freed African American slaves. He supported the 15th Amendment, voting rights for all black males. And he wanted a better deal for American working people. And he did not believe that we should get involved with Cuba and Spain, but as we know, his hand's going to be forced. You have to remember, our foreign policy back then was much different than it is today. Our foreign policy back then was we were isolationists. We didn't believe in getting involved in other incidents. We wanted to stay out of that. We wanted to basically keep to ourselves. So we're going to see this change during McKinley's presidency, and there are a few things that contributed to that, which we'll go into. The one thing that really pushed us into the Spanish-American War was the fact that one of our battleships, called the Maine, blew up in the Havana Harbor in Cuba. The forward magazines exploded where they kept all the ammunition. And really, to this day, it's still kind of a mystery. Most people will believe it was just an accident. However, our newspapers, which we'll talk about, blew the story up to try to get people to favor us going to war with Spain over Cuba. And we hear stories that the Spanish blew the ship up. There were Spanish mines in the water, and that could have been it. There's actually even a theory out that the Cubans actually blew it up to get us involved, although not real sure about that one. But anyway, we get involved in the Spanish-American War under William McKinley, and that's one of the things that he's known for. Remember the Maine became the battle cry. It's actually remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. That became the battle cry during this time. The Spanish-American War will last about 4 months, and it's a huge victory for us, but it's outside of our usual thinking, okay, because we actually gained territory from this, and actually pretty important territory. We'll gain Puerto Rico, which is still a U.S. territory today. You know, in fact, in their last election, there was talk about them becoming a state. They actually favored statehood, but there were some issues with that. So I'm not sure if that's going to happen. Guam in the Pacific, that is still a U.S. territory today. And then the Philippines. They were also a U.S. territory for a long time. They are now an independent country, but we still have very close ties to them. He will be reelected to a second term, and in 1900, which leads to the zero factor. Dun, 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 dun. The zero factor. This is a crazy, crazy thing. And I'm just going to read over some of this. Basically, if you were elected in a year ending in 0, you died in office. Let's go back. It starts in 1840. William Henry Harrison died of pneumonia after only 31 days in office. He was elected in 1840. 1860, Abraham Lincoln, obviously, assassinated. 1880, President Garfield assassinated. 1900, as we're going to see, President McKinley will also be assassinated. 1920, President Harding died of a stroke. 1940, President Roosevelt will die of a cerebral hemorrhage in 1945. 1960, President Kennedy is assassinated. 1980, President Reagan was shot but survived. So some of those people believe that that's when it was broken. And obviously George W. Bush went on to, he was elected in 2000 and nothing happened to him either. So kind of a weird situation there. Now McKinley's assassination was in his second term. Okay, September 6, 1901, he was visiting Buffalo, New York, and a man with a bandaged hand walked up to him. You can see this depiction here. Walked up to him and was acting like he was going to shake his hand, but there was a gun. 2 shots rang out. Leon Czolgosz, and here's how you spell his name, was a bitter man, hated all world leaders. He believed he was an anarchist, obviously kind of out there. And he basically just walks up and said he wanted to kill world leaders and shot President McKinley right there in Buffalo, New York at the exposition. They could not find the bullet. And basically, even though there was these new inventions out there and there was all this light, they just could not get that bullet out. And unfortunately, even though at one point it looked like McKinley may even recover, he will die 8 days later, and he will be our third president to be assassinated. So, let's look at the essential questions for post-Reconstruction. How did the lives of African Americans change? Hopefully you picked up on a few changes over the past couple lectures. The right to vote, the citizenship, right to own land. There were things where they could even hold office. The freedmen could hold office. But also there are negatives too. A lot of people were angry, especially down south for instance, with the Freedmen's Bureau. So there was maybe even more discrimination. Some things didn't change. We talked about the black codes. So there were things that were put in place to try to hold the African Americans down again. So there's, one of those questions with that one. Also with explain how Reconstruction ended. We talk about the election of 1877 and the compromise of the election of 1876 and the compromise of 1877 with President Hayes winning the election through the committee, and basically Hayes won the presidency in exchange for the old Southern governments coming back into power down south, which got rid of the carpetbagger governments and removed the troops from the South that were hanging around. Okay, and then the last one, major successes and failures of Reconstruction. Successes could be the fact that freedmen obviously the freedmen could hold offices. The African Americans received citizenship and the right to vote and more rights. There are some of the fact that the government did finally come back together with some of the amendments. However, the failures, there's still a lot of tension between the North and the South, especially over some of those amendments, especially the citizenship one, where they basically were not allowed to, the Southern governments were not allowed to come back into the fray unless they accepted that, which gave up their rights. The black codes that were enforced down south, even though they weren't supposed to, the failure of the Civil Rights Amendment. So lots of things, some good things that came out of Reconstruction and some bad things too. The biggest thing is, did Reconstruction, the the Congressional Reconstruction Act, did that really help our nation come together, or did it hinder it? My opinion, and you can form your own, but my opinion is that it actually slowed the process down and made things worse. The main question is, would have Lincoln's plan been better? Would have, what if Lincoln survived? Would the country be in a better place? That's the question to be asked. So we'll stop there.